In this video, you're going to be getting started with React, from creating a skeleton React app all the way to building this reusable real-world component, which is an autocomplete text box with suggestions that filter as you type. So what is React? React is a JavaScript library created by Facebook for building user interfaces. It allows you to build and combine reusable UI components, much like creating your own custom HTML tags. These components are declarative views which update as the data in your application updates, i.e. they react to changes in your application state, hence the name of the library. Enough background, let's get started. You need a recent version of Node for this to work, so if you haven't got that installed already, go and do that first. When that's done, in the terminal, I want you to type npm install -g create-react-app. This will install an npm package that creates bare-bones React apps for you with all the Webpack configuration and required modules already set up for you, so you can start coding straight away. After that's done installing, you need to do create-react-app, then a space and the name of whatever you want to call your new app. Let's call it my-first-app. And this will set up your new React app and install all the necessary dependencies. That'll take a little while, and after it's done, you need to go into the directory that's just been created. So that's my first app. And you'll see here it's installed an npm application for us. It's created our bare bones React app. And we just do an npm start. And this will compile the app and run the dev server. It's also in a moment going to open, here we go, it opens a browser window and runs the app in it for you. That's very convenient. So it's still just loading, it's still probably compiling in the background. And there we go. And this is the bare bones React app. And you can see here it tells you to go to src.app.js, edit the code and save, and it will auto reload. So let's do that now. To start off with, we're just going to fly through building a really simple component with React, just as a taster. After that, we'll move on to the autocomplete text box, which is more useful, but also more complex. Open the code in an editor of your choice, and go to the src folder, and then you want to go to app.js. And this is the main top-level app component that renders what we saw in the browser. If you remember, there's this text here about getting started. Let's just edit this and change it to say hello world. And if we save it and go back to the browser, the code recompiles, it hot reloads, and we get hello world. So now let's create our first React component, and then we'll be able to use it just like a custom HTML tag, really. We're going to make a component which is a button and some dynamic text. When you click the button, it's going to toggle hiding the text. So in src, I want you to create a new file. We're going to call it hidabletext.js. We're going to import React from React. Then we're going to export as default a new class, and we're going to call that hidable text, and it needs to extend the react.component class. We give it a constructor, and the constructor takes an argument called props. These are just properties for the component, and they can be passed in like attributes are passed to an HTML tag. And we do just need to call super in the constructor, passing through the props, and super just calls the parent class constructor, so it's calling the react.component constructor. That just ensures the class is set up properly. Next, we have a very special function called render. Now, whatever gets returned from render is what gets rendered in the browser for this component. So we're going to return some JSX, it's called, which is XML within JavaScript. And this JSX is just going to be a div. So it's just like doing HTML tags within our JavaScript, really. It's going to be a div. And then we're going to have a button. And we'll call it toggle. And then just some hard-coded text for now. Now we have this component, we can go ahead and import it into our app component. So we open that file and we just import it, import hideable text from hideable text. Now we can use it pretty much like a custom HTML tag. So if we go within this div class name app content, we just go hideable text like an HTML tag. We save it and then we'll have a look and see how it looks in the browser. And there we go, we've got our button that does nothing at the moment and our text. React elements can take arguments called props that are a lot like attributes for HTML tags. So to our hideable text, we'll add one called text, and as the value, just as a string, we will put dynamic text. Now we go back to our component, and that text prop will be available in the component within an object called this.props. It comes in via the constructor here and is passed to the superclass. So we want to output this here, and if you want to output the result of an expression in JSX, you just wrap the expression in curly braces. That's completely wrong. Wrap the expression in curly braces. So we're going to do this.props.text, and that will be the dynamic text we just passed in as the prop. So if we save this and take a look in the browser, the text should have changed. So as we can see, we've now got our dynamic text, and the button does absolutely nothing. Let's fix that now. Props are one form of data available to a React component. They are passed in from outside the component, as we saw, and are immutable. But we can also store internal mutable data within a component, and this is called state. We will define this within the constructor, so we will go this.state, and state is a special property on a React component, so it has to be called state. And it's just a plain old JavaScript object, so we can just define it as an object literal. We will add an isHidden property, defaulting to false. So obviously if isHidden is true, the text will be hidden, otherwise it will be shown. And we can achieve that by going down here and doing not this.state.isHidden and props.text. This means the text will only show if isHidden is true. Next, we need a way to toggle isHidden. So let's go up here, let's create a new method on the class called toggle isHidden. Doesn't take any arguments. And this is going to use a special method which is inherited from the react.component class. And this is called setState. For reasons I won't go into now because it's beyond the scope of the video, this .state should never be altered manually after being initially set up in the constructor. So we call this .setState, and this takes a function as an argument, and it gives us actually the current state as an argument to this function, and then this function has to return the changes we want to make to the state object in the form of an object. So we'll return an object, and we want isHidden to be the result of toggling the current isHidden, so current state.isHidden, And again, for reasons I won't go into now because it's too complicated for the moment, you must always get the current value of any state object when you're doing a set state from current state, not from this dot state. You'll have to watch my entire React course to find out why I think it's a bit more complicated. But this toggle is hidden function will do exactly what we want. Next comes the task of hooking toggle is hidden up to this button here. It's actually very simple. It's a lot like in HTML and JavaScript without React, how you would add an event handler. You just put it straight on as an attribute, on click in this case. It's going to be an expression, so we want the curly braces again. And then we just put an arrow function, and all this arrow function is going to do is call this.toggle is hidden. Let's save that and check this in the browser. First, I have just noticed a big error. In toggle is hidden, I set the new value of is hidden to be exactly the same as the current value, which is obviously wrong. We want to negate it, so it's toggled, and now it should work. So in the browser, we have the toggle button, we have the dynamic text, we click toggle, and the text disappears. We toggle it again, and it reappears. So that's working as intended. So what's happening here is, when we initially render the button, is hidden is false, and so the text is hidden. Then when we click the button, toggle is hidden is called, set state is called, and it sets is hidden to true. Each time we update the state of a React component, the component re-renders, so the render function is called again. And so when we click for the first time and is hidden is set to true, this function is then called again. This time is hidden is true, and so the text isn't shown. Now we're going to move on to building a more useful real-world component. I'm going to be teaching you how to build this autocomplete text box using React. It's one of those text boxes where you type and get a list of possible items you can select which fill in the text box, a bit like the auto-suggestion search boxes on most search engines. What I really like about this is that it has real-world uses. It's a very simple component, but by creating it you'll learn about reusable React components, props, component state, and using CSS with React. You'll first need to set up a new React app by installing Create React App, creating a new app with it, and then run it by going to the directory in the terminal and doing npm start. Alternatively, you could just put the code within the app you previously created. It's up to you. Open the code in an editor. We're going to create a new component. First, create a new file for your component and call it autocompletetext.js, and it should be in the src folder. Components are the building blocks of any React application. They can be configured using something called props, more on that later in the series, and they can hold their own mutable data called state. They can be used to represent anything in your UI, from small things like a standalone UI widget, such as this autocomplete text box we're going to create, right up into something large like an entire web page. Components are reusable, so you can use them many times on one page or even across different pages. They're also composable. You can think of them like Lego bricks. You can fit them together to build other larger components. First, we need to import the React module. You need to do this for every component you create. Then we create a class to represent our component, and we're going to call it autocomplete text. It needs to extend the react.component class in order to make it a component. Our text box will need the list of all possible items that it can autocomplete with. In a future video, I'll show you how to make that configurable, but for now we're just going to hardcode a list of names. To do this, first create a constructor. React component constructors must take an argument called props and call the superclass constructor passing the props argument to it. This just ensures the component is set up properly. Let's add a member variable called items, so it's this.items, and it's going to be an array. We create a member variable so we can access it from anywhere in the class later. So let's add some names now to the array. These will be what can be shown in the autocomplete dropdown. They're all the possible items to autocomplete with. Now, the markup for our component. At the heart of any React component is the render function. It will examine all of the component's data, and based on this, will render the markup for the component. The idea is that when the component's data changes, the markup changes so the user sees something different. So we define our render function. From this, we must return the React elements we want to represent our component. Some magic called JSX lets us write them directly within JavaScript as HTML tags. So we're going to return a wrapper div, and inside it a text input. This is going to be our text box. We're also going to put an unordered list to hold our autocomplete suggestions. We'll worry about showing only items that match the text entered later. For now, let's show all the items in the list. So we have this as an array, so we can just output an li for each item in the items array. Now, this is going to be an expression, and to mix expressions into our markup using JSX, we need to wrap them in curly braces. Anything within curly braces will be evaluated and the value output within our markup. This can be anything from a simple string to the results of a function call or even other React elements. We want one li per item in the list. So inside those curly braces, we're going to map over the array and output an li for each item. Within the li, we have the item itself. This itself is an expression, so is also wrapped in the curly braces. The result of this map is an array of React elements. Now, if we put an array of React elements within curly brackets, each element in that array will be rendered. Although we're nowhere near finished yet, I think this is a good time to check how our new component looks in the browser. So far we have our new component, but haven't used it anywhere. We can use the component just like a custom HTML tag. The component itself is just the definition. We need a new instance of this definition, which will be a React element. Let's do that now. So you want to go to app.js. This is our main top level component for the app. And we're just going to delete all this. We don't need that header section at all. And we also want to go into index.css and just put 50 pixels of margin at the top of the body, just so we've got a bit of space up there when we put our text box in. So first we need to import our components module. And we're going to use the component just like a custom HTML tag. So it's just autocomplete text as an HTML tag. So you should be running the app using npm start in the folder in the terminal so that it will hot reload in the browser when you change the code. Let's take a look. As you can see, we have our text box and our list with all the names in it. When the user types in the text box, we're going to need to know about it so we can filter the list so that only items that match what the user types are displayed. We're also going to need the current text which has been entered for the same reason. So let's get that text now. You can add events to elements in React much the same way as you can in HTML. So this text input has an onChange event available. So we add that and we're going to assign a function to it. Since a function is an expression, we wrap it in curly brackets. And all the function is going to do is take the event that has been generated and console.log event e.target.value or e.target.value, because e is the event, target is the element which is the target of the event, and the value is the value of the HTML text input. Let's check that in the browser. So we right-click and choose Inspect to open the developer console and choose Console from the tab above. Then we type in the text field, and as we do, you can see the text being output each time we change the value. In order to only show items in the list that match the text entered, we need to use the component state. Component state is just internal data belonging to the current instance of the component. Since it belongs to the current instance, you can have multiple versions of the same component on the same page at the same time, and they each keep their own individual state. So in this.items, we have all the possible items. We will store the list of items which match what is entered in the text box in the component's state. The state is initialized in the constructor. It is just a plain old JavaScript object, but it must be called state, and must be on the current instance, i.e. on this, as this is the property react.component uses for the state. It's like a property which is special to React. So we're going to create this.state, and it's going to equal a new object literal. For the list of suggestions, we'll have a property called suggestions. When the component is first created, we want the suggestions to be empty, so let's go ahead and make it an empty array. Let's create a function to handle the user typing in the text box. We'll call it onTextChanged, and it's very important that it's an arrow function or this won't work. If you don't understand why this is, you need to learn about function context in JavaScript. The function will take the onChange event as an argument. We'll call it e. And now let's go down to the onChange attribute in the text box, and we're going to add that function there. We just put this.onTextChange. There's no brackets at the end. We're not calling the function, just assigning it. So we need to get the value from the event. If the string is empty, we're going to want to make sure that the suggestions are empty, as there's nothing to match on. This case would happen, for example, if the user types a single character and then deletes it. Now, you might think we empty the suggestions array by doing something like this.state.suggestions equals empty array. That seems to make sense, doesn't it? We just set the suggestions array on the state to be empty. However, this would be the wrong way to update a value in the state. The reason for this is that what gets rendered in the render function will probably depend upon the state. Now, in this case, it doesn't yet, but we'll be making render do this in just a minute. The idea is, when you change the state, you change what gets rendered so that the component displays something different. This is what makes React components dynamic rather than static. For this reason, the component needs to know that the state has changed so it can re-render, call render again, and display the new version of the component to the user. React.component gives us a function, it's called setState, that does just this. So it's this.setState, and now this takes a function which will return an object with any state changes in it. So any properties we want to change in the state go in that object. The reason it takes a function that returns an object instead of just an object is beyond the scope of this video. I do, however, talk about this in my Udemy course. So we want to set the suggestions to empty array, so the function just returns an object with suggestions as an empty array. You don't need to return the entire state from this function, just the properties you want to change. The else case is if for the text isn't empty. For this case, we're going to create a case-insensitive regex to test for matches in the items list that start with the text the user entered. Next, we're going to define the list of matching suggestions and put it in a const. And this is going to be defined as taking the contents of the items array, sorting it alphabetically, and filtering it for items that match the regex we just created. We then need to update the state with the filtered list of suggestions. And actually, I've just thought of a better way of writing this. So we're going to use let and define suggestions so it's mutable, and we're going to initialize it as an empty array. And if the length of the string entered is more than 0, we set suggestions to be the filtered list of items. So we just need the regex in there, and then the filtered suggestions in there as well. And then after that, we just set suggestions in the state. This does exactly the same thing, it's just more concise. Now we're only going to render the filtered list of suggestions instead of the full list. I'm going to create a function to do this, which I'm going to call render suggestions. So we destructure the suggestions from the state. And if this list is empty, we don't want to show the UL element at all. To do this, we can just return null from this function. Anything that is null won't render anything to the browser. So next is if it's not empty. And in this case, we want to copy and paste all the code from down here from the render function, or cut and paste rather, for the UL. So we're going to return that. And within that, instead of mapping over the items array, which is sort of all the items that we have, because we only want to output the suggestions, we change it to suggestions instead of items. Then in the render function, we call render suggestions in the place of where we had the markup for our UL. So now what should happen is when I type in the text box, only items which match the value entered get shown. But we have an error. v.test is not a function. It actually says there's 2 errors on the page, but they're both the same. Let's just go and fix this now. So I've got things the wrong way around here. I've done text value.test instead of regex.test, and I need to pass in the text value to the test function. So just the wrong way around there. We go back, try again. Cannot read property map of undefined. Again, just a small bug. It's not this.suggestions.map. It's just suggestions, as we've already destructured. Third time's a charm. We're now getting everything filtered as I type. What's happening is the suggestions are being updated in the state as I type. Each time they are, the component's render function gets called again, and it only returns the list with the matching items, as this is what's in the state at the time the function gets called. So we have our filtered list. Next, we need to make it so when we click an item on the list, it populates the text box with it. To do this, we need to be in control of the value of the text input. Now, there are 2 types of controls in React, or inputs rather, controlled and uncontrolled. Currently, this text box is uncontrolled. This means the browser controls the value. The user types, and the text appears in the text box. If we make our text box controlled, we control the value via React. We make it controlled simply by adding a value prop, and we'll set this now to an empty string. So look what happens when we're in control of the text box via React. I am actually now typing in the text box and nothing will appear. We will have to set the value ourselves from within the component. We will set the value of the text box using the component state. To do this, we're going to add a text property to the state, and the value should just be an empty string. Then we want to go down to our render function, and we want to extract this text value from the state. And then in our text box, we're going to make that value prop the text from the state. So that's what goes in the text box. Now we go to the onTextChange function, and when the text box value changes, we want to set that value in the state as text. Now when we type in the text box, the value updates. To select the item, we need a function to say a suggestion has been selected. So we're going to go ahead and add a function, suggestion selected. It's going to take the value of the suggestion, which will be one of the items from the suggestion list, as an argument. We're then going to update the state, so the value the text box uses is the selected suggestion. At this point, we're also going to wipe the suggestions list by setting it to be an empty array, as we don't want to still show it when the user has just selected an item. Finally, we need this to fire when a suggestion is clicked on. So we're going to go down to the li for a suggestion item, and we're going to add an onClick event handler, and we're going to add an arrow function in there, and this is going to call this.suggestion selected with the suggestion text for this li. We should now be done and everything should work. Now as we type, it filters the list, and when we make our selection, it populates the text box. So that's a success. There are a number of ways to handle CSS in React. Today I'm going to show you the simplest. You see here we have our app.css file. This came with create React app. And then if we go into our components, our app components JavaScript file, we import it just like we would a JavaScript module, not forgetting to add the .css extension. This part's very important. Now, looking in the browser and viewing the source, we go into the head section and we scroll down a bit, and there's this style tag here, and within it we see the contents of app.css. What's happening here is that Create React App has set up a Webpack loader for us. Webpack is a commonly used JavaScript build tool. Anyway, this loader is intercepting imports of files based on the .css extension. It is then adding code to add a style tag into the web page using JavaScript and putting the contents of all the imported CSS files in here. That's what happened with app.css. So let's add our own CSS file. So we add a new file for our CSS, autocomplete text.css. Within that, we're going to add a class, autocomplete text. For now, we're just going to put a width of 100% on it. Next, we go to our component, and we need to import autocomplete text.css. Remember the .css extension. This now ensures that the CSS we wrote shows up in the head of the document, just like with app.css. We can now apply the class we added to a React element, so we're going to apply it to the wrapper div. Now, one thing to note, this is very important, in JSX you can't just use the class attribute because it's a reserved word in JavaScript, so you can't put just that. Instead we have to use class name, uppercase on N, but this acts just like the class attribute in HTML, so we add our autocomplete text class in there. Let's check that in the browser. So we can go to the head and we can see the style has been added there. Looking at the finished product, we can work out what we need to do in terms of styling. Firstly, let's take the width. Since this is a reusable component, we want a flexible width. I think the best way to achieve this is to make everything 100% width. Then, when someone uses the component, they can put in a fixed width container in order to dictate the final width of the component. Now let's look at the border. So we have a grey border with a drop shadow. My first thought was to put a border around both the text input and the UL that appears with the suggestions. The main problem with this is that if we put a border and drop shadow on both elements, they would overlap at the bottom of the text input and the top of the UL. The simplest solution is just that the container div has a border and a drop shadow, while the UL and text have none. This way, when just the text box is shown, the border wraps that. When the suggestion list is also shown, it wraps both components. So let's make those changes now. The width of our container is already 100%, so let's add a new selector for the text input and give that a width of 100% too. We then add a grey border to our container. And then we want a drop shadow on it too, so we add some code from that. Now, I just generated this with an online tool. You can Google CSS box shadow generator and you'll find a similar tool. And we take off the border from the input. So we're going to go into our app component now, and we're going to wrap the text box in a div with the class name of app-component. Then we go back to app.css and we do a selector for app-component as a class. And we're going to put some margin on the top of it because we just want a bit of space between the top of the browser and the component. And then the margin at the sides is going to be auto to center it. And we give it a width of 600 pixels. This is to constrain the size of our reusable component from outside of the component. So once we finish that, we'll save and have a look in the browser. Taking a look at this, we see that the text in the list is centered. We want it left aligned. Also, we want to get rid of those bullet points. Let's do that now. So I'm just going to give the entire div and also the input a consistent text style, so they just look the same. I'm now going to put in a new selector for the UL. And with list style type set to none, I get rid of the bullets and I align the text to the left. If we have a look at our elements, we can see the alignment is a bit off between the text input and the list, and there's this funny thing going on with the right hand side of the text box. There's a couple of things going on here. We need to use border box sizing on it, otherwise the text input can end up being more than 100% width of its parent. Both the text input and the list items should also have consistent padding. Finally, there's also a small, you probably can't see it, but there is a small gap between the top of the UL and the bottom of the text input that throws things off just a little bit. This is caused by the new line between the two in the markup. This can be fixed by using the before pseudo selector. First, we'll take away all the margin and padding on the UL element. We won't be needing that. Then we're going to add a consistent margin and padding to both the li and text input. So we add a new selector for the li, put the padding in there, and then put the same padding on the text input. And we need to also add to that box sizing and set it to border box for the text input so it doesn't get more than 100% in width. Finally, we're going to add a pseudo selector for our UL. This is the before pseudo selector we're going to use, and it just allows us to remove the white space before the UL. So we're going to set the content to be an empty string. I also want to remove this blue highlighting when the text box is in focus. This is very simple to do. We just add outline none to the text input. Things are looking really pretty good now. We actually do want a border at the top of the UL though, just to separate it from the text input. We also want to make the list of items look clickable. We can do this by adding a cursor style and some hover styling to the UIs. So we add a border to the top of the UL, that's of course 1 pixel solid grey, and we set cursor to pointer on the LI so that the cursor has a little hand on hover, so it looks like a link, something we can click. Then we're going to add a new selector, and we're going to use the hovo pseudo selector on the LI selector. And then on hovered, we're going to give all the LIs a background, just sort of a light grey background, and an underline to emphasize this to the user, just to emphasize that they're selectable. So yeah, that all looks really good. I want some good data for our suggestions, so I'll get a list of all the countries in the world. I Google for it, and there's actually a text file for it on GitHub, which is perfect. So I click View Raw, and I copy all of them. We want the countries to be an array, so I create a new module, countries.js in src, and we simply paste in the entire list, and we're going to export it from the module as the default export. I'm going to wrap it in backticks so it can be multi-line as opposed to, say, single or double quotes, and make sure there's no space at the beginning or the end of the backticks. And then I do a dot split on the new line character, and this will make it an array, one line, or country in this case, per item. The module now exports an array of country names. So if we go to our component, we have an array called this.items, which contains the hard-coded items, names in this case. We need to transform this into a prop. Props in React are a way to get data into a component in order to make it configurable. You pass props to a React element just like an HTML attribute. So if we have a look at the text input down here, we use two props on that. One is value, one is on change. So this is just how you get props into a React element. And you can see up here, the props are passed to the constructor. We then pass them to super, and after that, they can be accessed via an object, this.props, from anywhere in the class. So we remove this.items from the constructor, we don't need it anymore. And we use this variable in the function onTextChange, where we filtered these items to get the suggestions based on what the user typed. So let's destructure this .props to get a prop called items, and then we use that in place of this .items. Now we need to go to the app component where we actually use the text box and passed in the countries as a prop called items. So first we need to import our countries from the countries module we created. Then we add items as a prop, just like an attribute, and give it the value of countries in curly braces. So now the text box has our list of countries available. But what happens if we wanted to add another text box with different items on the same page? We simply add another autocomplete text tag. This one will set the items to be an array of names. We'll just hard code the array straight in the curly brackets, straight into the prop items. We now have two autocomplete text boxes. They're a bit squished together, so let's just add a bit of space in here. So now we've got two autocomplete text boxes on one page. Each has its own internal state. Both has its own list of items. So we've created a truly reusable component. If you want to progress to building entire apps in React instead of just components, see the link to my course, Learn React and Redux from Beginner to Paid Professional, in the video description.